In this lecture, we'll primarily be looking at the economic and political philosophies of Karl Marx.
On this slide, we're going to take a moment to examine the influences on the young Karl Marx to see how he ultimately arrived at his economic philosophy of communism or socialism. The primary influences first we're going to see is in the field of philosophy with G.W.F. Hegel, who is pictured on this slide, and then also from the field of religion or theology, Ludwig Feuerbach will have an enormous influence, moving Marx away from a spiritual worldview to a material worldview. And then finally, as we move specifically into the field of economics, Comte de Saint-Simon will have much to do with what Marx will eventually develop as his form of socialism. Okay, Hegel is considered to be the most important philosopher of the early 19th century. He developed a philosophy that tried to look backward through time to incorporate all of history as building or evolving to the present moment, and that what's happening in the present moment will continue to build and evolve into what will be the ultimate reality. Hegel argued that this process is driven by a spirit or mind that many would call God, and this is how he described the process. First, you have an initial idea that's called a thesis that presents something as knowledge or truth. Immediately after the thesis, you're going to have a statement that challenges the thesis, so that will be the antithesis, the antithesis. And so with these two statements battling with one another, we see that they are engaged with one another, and eventually these two opposing statements will evolve and will eventually mature and merge into a synthesis of the two ideas coming together. Now, the process doesn't stop there for Hegel. As he continues to look at reality in the present day, that synthesis that is formed will now become a new thesis to be challenged by an antithesis, and then, of course, another synthesis will be formed, and this will continue throughout time into the future. Now, again, Hegel's process here is spirit-driven, believing that there is a sort of spiritual realm, and you can go so far as to say is a God figure. But one of the primary theologians of the day, ironically, was an agnostic, perhaps even an atheist. His name was Ludwig Feuerbach. And after Marx encountered Feuerbach's teachings, he found that those teachings were much more compatible with his worldview. That rather than believing in some sort of spirit or mind that you can't prove exists as driving this evolutionary process of history, Marx wanted to deal with just the material reality that he could observe and that he could scientifically examine. And so what we have with Feuerbach is Feuerbach saying that this concept of God is really nothing other than a projection of humankind, that there is no God who created humankind, but it is humankind that has created God. And the reason we use the term projection here is if you want to picture an old film projector and you see the picture being put up on the screen, it looks so real. It looks like what's happening on the screen is really taking place, but you know that if you go up to that material screen, that actual screen, and try to reach in and touch the character or touch the landscape, you won't be able to. It'll just be the screen. And so this is really a pretty decent metaphor for what Feuerbach is saying, that we as human beings have created this God. We have projected this God, but he does not really exist. And because that's dealing with the world in a material sense, Marx found that quite attractive. And lastly, Comte de Saint-Simon elucidated an economic theory that denounced capitalism as a system that oppresses and abuses the poor in order to increase the wealth of those who are already wealthy. And you will see in the following two slides that Karl Marx finds this teaching extremely convincing. Marx here is pictured on the left, and to the right is Friedrich Engels, who ended up being a very close personal friend of Karl Marx, but maybe even more important than the friendship is the professional relationship that they developed in writing with one another. In a sense, this is a perfect pairing for two thinkers, because Engels would remark that the genius of the two of them was Karl Marx, that Karl Marx was the one who had the deep insight, and Engels' job was really to take, for example, the words of a great author that may not be quite put together in the most readable way, and Engels would act as sort of an editor to put what were Marx ideas together in a way that they could be more easily understood. These two men worked together for decades in England, developing their communist vision for a more just society. That written work is known as the Communist Manifesto. Now, Marx's economic philosophy was termed dialectical materialism by Engels, and this is the part of Marx's teaching that ties in quite a bit with Hegel, and that Marx sees that there is one economic system that will be challenged by another, thesis, antithesis, and as these two are engaged with one another, we see a new economic system, a synthesis, will eventually form. And so this sort of process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis that you saw with Hegel, that's called a dialectical process. And because, of course, Marx did not believe in the spiritual component of that, this is why Engels refers to Marx's teaching as dialectical materialism. Now, in the present day, as Marx observed the society and economics in which he was living, he observed that there was a smaller group that we would probably call the upper middle class to upper class, called the bourgeois. And the bourgeois were the ones that lived with their wealth, but they lived with their wealth, Marx observed, at least in his opinion, as parasites, as they obtained their wealth from the working class, also known as the proletariat. Now, as Marx took a step back to try to provide a larger view or a larger scope of human history, these are the 5 major economic systems that he has seen humankind move through. One was the primitive tribal or primitive communal. That would eventually move into the slave-master relationship. And finally, next we come to what is oftentimes called the feudal system, in which you have a few lords who have the power, the land, and the wealth, and they utilize serfs, labor, to work that land, and the lord gets wealthier and wealthier. That easily unfolds into what we just looked at on the previous bullet, with the bourgeois being the business owners and already having wealth, and they hire the proletariat to work for them, according to Marx, at wages that are not fair, so that the proletariat continues to struggle to get by, while the bourgeois continues to get wealthier and wealthier. And then finally, Marx is hoping that we are now seeing the emerging economic system of socialism or communism as an improvement over all that has come before. Now, just as you're responsible from the previous slide to know that Marx and Engels worked together for the Communist Manifesto to provide their economic vision of socialism or communism, I also want you to be aware of another written work, a written work that is primarily a work of Marx, but as Marx got into worse health later in his life, Engels had to do much more editing and writing for Karl Marx. This work is called Das Kapital, and in Das Kapital we see Marx's criticism of capitalism. Now, because this is such an emotionally charged issue in American culture, again, that Marxism is almost seen as a dirty word, I do want to be as fair as I can be to Karl Marx here to state that this was not an emotional or sentimental argument that Marx makes against capitalism. Instead, he goes to extremes to make sure that he is measured and that he is providing scientific observation to try to be as objective as possible, and simply wants to provide an analysis of how capitalism, as he sees it, will eventually cause its society to implode. According to Marx, the proletariat, the working class, are duped, tricked into thinking that as long as they participate in the economic system, they inevitably will become one of the bourgeois, or maybe even not upper middle class, maybe they'll become one of the extremely wealthy. An important term I want you to know, this will be on your final exam, is that this dynamic Marx called being co-opted, that you are co-opted into the capitalist system, that you don't actually see who you are as a suffering individual within the system, but instead you see the system as a whole as it's being presented to you by those who have power, and those who have power saying, you know, just keep on going through your daily struggles of these jobs that we give you, and maybe eventually you can be like us. And so Marx sees that there is something within the powerful that is manipulating and coercing the proletariat. Now, this climb to the top of the ladder rarely does happen for the working class, because they're caught in a trap where they just live paycheck to paycheck, and they have to make hard choices between whether they're going to have food for their family or medicine for their children. And all the while, the proletariat sees their bosses and sees the business owners becoming increasingly wealthy. And so Marx would make this observation in Das Kapital that this is capitalism as he sees it. Now, eventually, according to Marx, this drives the proletariat into a stage of alienation in which the job is something that is hated or despised, but something that one must do each day in order to earn just enough money to barely pay the bills, if you're even able to do that. Marx remarks that for the proletariat there is little or no passion for pride in one's work. And instead of living this alienated life, alienated from your occupation, alienated from your job, Marx writes that instead of the alienated life, people long to live a species life. And the species life is a holistic life, is a fulfilling life in which people feel a pleasing connection to their work and they're proud of their work. And not just a connection to one's work, but also a connection to all of the environment, your surroundings, that you are at home. You feel content in that place, that you have a good job that you're proud of. It doesn't matter what doesn't matter what the job is. You can be proud of any job, but you're invested in that job. And also you realize that that job takes place in a certain environment, so you're also very connected to your surroundings.